the mystery of Shechem. And we're going to find out that this particular portion of the land of Canaan was so sacred, was so mysterious, it was guarded for 4 generations. It became the heritage of the house of Israel, was Shechem. But we're going to ask the question, to what extent, brothers and sisters, did Joseph find his brethren? And I'm going to give you a big spoiler. Because Joseph found his brethren beyond the grave. That's where we're going to be going, brothers and sisters. We're going to be going beyond the grave at Shechem. He wants to bring them back to this special piece of land that was there for 4 generations. In fact, the word Shechem means the burden. It comes from the Hebrew idea to have a responsibility. And Joseph now is going to take the burden of finding his brethren as his responsibility to bring them back to the place of Shechem. And in verse 17, well, just to emphasize the point, it says that they had departed. It means to pull out. There was something about this place, brothers and sisters, where those brothers did not want to be. They departed from Shechem. So we're going to find out then, well, what's the backdrop? Where do we begin to arc our narrative around this special place? Well, of course, it all began with one man, didn't it? A man who was called out from the Gentile place of Ur. Can anyone remember who that man was? Abraham. So we're going to go, brothers and sisters, we're going to go to Genesis chapter 12, please. And we know this particular chapter. We see Abraham. It's not Abraham now, is he? It's Abram. Abram has been called out of Ur, and he's there with his wife, and he's there with his nephew, and all the substance they had gathered, and they're now going and embarking on an eternal journey, friends. This wasn't just a journey of 600 miles. This was an eternal journey, and the journey of Abraham is still continuing today. We're still journeying to the promised land, aren't we? We're walking in the footsteps of the great patriarch. The theme of this afternoon is the water at the well, so this is a great start. Thank you, Brother Sean. So they travel 600 miles, and if you look in verse 6 of Genesis chapter 12, and Abraham passed through the land unto a place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was there in the land. And right here in Genesis 12 and verse 6, as he saunters 600 miles, weary and burdened, he comes to this very location at Shechem, an unknown territory. You would pass it by if you saw Shechem, and I've been to Shechem. If anyone else, it's nothing. It's a wilderness. But at that particular spot, Yahweh, the God of Israel, says, stop. And Abraham stops. He looks around, and he sees here that he's in the plain of Moreh. And has anyone got a different translation for that word there, the plain? It's the tree. The oak. He's right there at a tree. And when we think of a tree, brothers and sisters, who do we get projected to? We're in the spirit of the Lord Jesus Christ. There's an oak tree here in the plain of Moreh. And the name Moreh means the place of teaching. And there's a tree here in the place of teaching. And right specifically in this very location, as Abraham is there with all of his family, all of his cattle, all of his ox, all of his sheep, God says, stop here. The tree. At the place of teaching. And verse 7, and the Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. And Abraham now is so compelled, he's so utterly astonished that this was the land, that right at that location, he built an altar, didn't he? And the Lord said, well, this spot here, Shechem, is where it all begins. It begins, Abraham, here. this is the land. This is the land. And Abraham now, to mark the territory of Israel, to mark his approval, the stamp of Yahweh's authority, Abraham, the great patriarch, built an altar in Shechem right there. And you know what? We're not told in Genesis 12. Does anybody know what Abraham did right now after building the altar? We're not told in Genesis, but we're told in Acts chapter 7 that after building the altar, he purchased it. The deeds were written, the signature was inscribed, and the paper was passed, and, well, Abraham purchased Shechem. Now, he didn't need to purchase it, did he? Because after all, Yahweh had said, this is the land. I give it to you. But there was something special, something in the heart of Abraham. He felt he needed to purchase this land. It was going to be his inheritance. And so he purchased right there in Acts chapter 7 and verse 16, Shechem. There's something, brothers and sisters, mystical. There's something sacred about this land, something so uniquely special that goes beyond all of the portions of Israel. And this was Abraham's. What a man, brothers and sisters, to own a piece of land, Abraham's. And right now, well, it's in Palestine. And who do the Palestinians believe their forefather was? Abraham. Oh, it's not theirs, friends, because it was going to be passed on to the other son. Not Ishmael, but the inheritance was to be passed on to the only begotten of Abraham. It was going to be passed on to Isaac. But we're going to go to the son of Isaac, who was Jacob. So if we go to Genesis chapter 33, Genesis chapter 33, we're going to pick up the narrative here. Now, we're going to see Jacob. He's returning to Canaan. He's heavy and laden, working for his uncle. And we know what happened there. So just as Abraham was called out, well, now Jacob is called out and is equally as vexed as his grandfather. And he comes now to reconcile with his brother Esau. And after doing that, he goes in Genesis 33 to verse 18 to a land. And notice this in verse 18, and Jacob came to Shechem, the city of where? Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. He's there. And notice the phrase here where it says, and Jacob came to Shechem. Well, actually, what it should say is that Jacob came in peace. He'd reconciled with his brother. He'd got the wives that he wanted. He'd done the work for his uncle. And now in peace, he's desperately trying to get to this location. The stories of Shechem, the great story of his grandfather, Abraham, that when Abraham came in Genesis 12, after being called out of Ur, that this was the land of Abraham at Shechem. And it was Jacob's greatest desire to get to that place. And he comes to Shechem in peace. And what do you think, brothers and sisters? What do you think Jacob would see when he came to that portion of land? What was there, do you think? What had been built? The altar. And marking the territory of Israel, the inheritance, was, well, an altar still there. And I believe it was still there because, well, we're going to find out in verse 19, he does something. But there's something remarkable that what's happened at the land of Shechem. For some unknown reason, the scriptures are hidden in what's happened, but the land of Shechem had somehow been dispossessed from the children of Abraham. Abraham no longer owned the territory of Shechem. And maybe he'd gone so far out of the land, it somehow had lost the deeds of Shechem. Because if you look in verse 19, well, what does he do? He buys the land. So Jacob feels so compelled again that he has to can you imagine that? Imagine owning something and then repossessing it after purchase. Well, Jacob does it. because his heart beats for Shechem. And he purchases the land, a field, and he spread his tent and the hand of the children of Hamor, the Shechem's father, and he bought it for 100 pieces of money. So he's there buying the land of Shechem. I dare say he spent the earnings of Laban to repossess what he felt was rightfully his, and by law it was. But look at verse 20. Look at verse 20. And there he erected there an altar and called the name of the altar El Elohe Israel. Now, what did Abraham do? Well, we agree, don't we, that he built. Would you agree with that? He built an altar at Shechem. Well, it doesn't say that about Jacob, does it? It doesn't say Jacob built an altar. The actual phrase is that Jacob erected an altar. Do you know what that Hebrew word means? He repaired it. There was the altar of his grandfather Abraham, and after repurchasing the land, he fixed. He made it straight, it says in the Hebrew, the altar of his grandfather. And the first thing he does then is he renames it. It's no longer called Shechem, is it? I mean, we call it Shechem, but Jacob calls it El Elohe Israel. And in the English, the name of Shechem is called the strength of the powerful ones of Israel. It's not a name, it's a title. He titles it the strength of the mighty ones of Israel. And when I say the mighty ones, who do you think about? The saints, the resurrected ones. Jacob believed in the resurrection, and he purchased a piece of land and called it that this is the place of the resurrected ones of Israel. That in this land, we're going to see Israel resurrected. There was something about this land in Jacob's heart that he wanted. He desperately wanted this land because he felt that it spoke of the great promise of Abraham. After rebuilding the altar, after purchasing it twice, after losing it once, desperation caused that he would repurchase and name it now. Well, named it after the God of Israel. This is dedicated to the God of resurrection, the God of Israel. Now we're going to turn the golden thread of the Bible now, and we're going to keep this thread alert. This is what my dad always used to say to me growing up, the golden thread. And we're going to weave another tapestry together, and we're going to go now to Genesis chapter 48. And Jacob now is an old man. Years have passed, and he's gone through his almighty struggles. And as an older man, he's having a private conversation. Who do you think he's going to have the private conversation with? Let me give you a clue. It's his favored son, Joseph. And just before Jacob is to pass off the scene, just before, well, it was going to be Joseph, it says, who was to close the eyes of his father. That was the promise to Jacob, that Joseph was going to be the man to close his eyes. And here he is speaking to his most beloved son. And we're going to see now another deed written. This is the arrangement of the inheritance. And Jacob now is writing this final inheritance in a conversation with his son. And in Genesis chapter 48, in verse 21 to 22, and Israel said unto Joseph, behold, I die. This is the will, the final will of Jacob. Behold, I die, but God shall be with you and shall bring you again to the land of your fathers. And Joseph is being told here by Jacob the very words that were said to Abraham. It was only fitting, wasn't it, that Jacob ended his narrative with Joseph. He ended his conversation with Joseph, well, with the man he loved deeply. If he loved Joseph, he respected his grandfather. The words of Abraham were said that God will bring you back up to the land of your fathers. And in verse 22, Jacob says to Joseph, moreover, I have given thee a portion above thy brethren. That's it. That's the conversation. I have given you a portion above. Something interesting is happening here. There's a subtext that's happening here in Genesis chapter 48, because what we're finding out here that, well, behind the scenes, Jacob now is making Joseph his firstborn son. Joseph was the favored son of his most favored wife. And in Deuteronomy, what it tells us explicitly that the deeds, the inheritance, the will was given to the firstborn, wasn't it? And you can imagine the scrabble between the brothers and the sisters, well, that the firstborn would have the inheritance. And Jacob now is making, well, his will to Joseph. Because we're told in Chronicles that, well, who was the firstborn of Jacob, by the way? Who was the rightful firstborn? Reuben, of his less favored wife. But it wasn't to be to Reuben, says Chronicles. Well, the firstborn, the mark of his inheritance was, well, Joseph. And he's been told here, Joseph, that there was going to be a token of a special portion of an inheritance given to him. We know Joseph's name means addition, a double portion. And this was to be the double portion that was given to Joseph. What was the portion, do you think? In fact, let me ask a better question. What do you think the word portion is in Genesis chapter 48 and verse 22? What do you think that Hebrew word portion is? It's the Hebrew word Shechem. The portion was given to Joseph, and it was now his. Joseph had the land of Shechem. Right here in Genesis chapter 48, the promise would flow of Shechem would flow from him. And look what it says, the conversation continues. I always find it really eerie reading a conversation between a dying man and his son. This happened. And if you carry your eyes down, well, Jacob continues and says, I'm going to give you this portion of Shechem and above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and with my bow. What's confusing here, do you think? Because Jacob here is saying, well, I took the land from the Amorite. Did that happen? What did Jacob actually do in Genesis chapter 33? He bought it. Purchased it right there. But now Jacob is saying, well, he had to fight for it. Well, we know what happened in Genesis chapter 33. Jacob bought and purchased Shechem. But what happened in the next chapter? Genesis chapter 34. Two brothers, Simeon and Levi, the sons of Jacob, go into a little village called where? Shechem. And what do they do in Shechem? They massacred an entire village because they felt their sister was defiled. And Jacob now in the very next chapter, says to those two brothers, "You have made my name stink among the inhabitants of this land." And God says to him in the very next chapter, "Go to Bethel." So Jacob lost it. Abraham purchased it and lost it. Jacob repurchased it and lost it. And now poor old Jacob, he's got no money left, so he has to fight for it. He puts his life on the line. He puts his neck on the block, and he gets his bow and he gets his sword, and he fights for Shechem. And he reclaims through blood on the hands of this old patriarch a land which he bought, a land that was dispossessed, but he murdered and did the very same thing that his sons did, because he was so desperate to reclaim this land, to give it to his beloved son Joseph. And I think there's another subtext happening between the lines here, because I think Joseph was being told by Jacob, don't lose it. Keep that land, for it is a portion above your brethren, a special land. Well, if you flick over one page to Genesis chapter 49, we're going to see another conversation. And this is a conversation that is in front of his brethren. And in verse 22, his brethren now surrounding Jacob. And just as Isaac was an old man and places his hand upon Esau and Jacob's head and gives that final blessing, well, in the very same spirit, Jacob is now an old man. He's about to die, and he's had that conversation with his special son, and Joseph knows now who the portion of Shechem is to go to, and he's shielded himself from his brethren because this was so special. And now Jacob, in front of all the brethren, goes through each one and gives his final blessing across those brethren who contain so much rivalry and history together. And it comes now to Joseph. And you can imagine all those brethren eagerly listening patiently to what was the blessing to be given to their favored brother whom they sold to Egypt. And in verse 22, Jacob says the words, Joseph, he says, is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. I think right there at that phrase, I think the brethren got it. I think the penny dropped right then and there when Jacob called Joseph a fruitful well. Because what else was found at Shechem? In fact, what was dug at Shechem? Can anyone remember? A well. And can anyone remember where we find the well in the Bible? It's only mentioned once, and it's in the very reading we had. In John chapter 4, Jesus finds himself weary and burdened. Isn't that an interesting phrase? It says of Jesus that he was weary, just as Jacob was weary, just as Abraham was weary. And Jesus, well, the son of Abraham, finds himself at Shechem weary. But I want us to notice here where it says the branches. If you look at Genesis chapter 49 and verse 22, where it says the branches run over the wall. Well, what other word do you have there in Genesis chapter 49 and verse 22 for the phrase branches? The daughters. And in Genesis 49 and verse 22, well, Joseph is being told that the branches are, well, their daughters. The daughters are going to run all across the well. It doesn't make sense, does it? How can a branch be a daughter? How can a branch, brothers and sisters, somehow be a daughter? Who was the bride? And where was the bride grafted? It was grafted into the tree, wasn't it? In the tree. And Joseph is being told here that this special portion was to be given to Joseph, and there was going to be a well in which the daughters would walk, and the daughters would sit upon the well. And when Jesus, many years later, found himself at the place of Shechem, who does he meet at Shechem? A daughter. A daughter of Samaria. He's the vine, brothers and sisters, Jesus. He's the fruitful bough, the well. And he's right there in John chapter 4, and he sees a daughter of Samaria, and she sees her Messiah, doesn't she? She sees her Messiah at the well. And what happened before at Shechem? Well, Dinah the daughter was, well, what happened to Dinah the daughter? She was lost. Dinah the daughter was defiled at Shechem. But Jesus comes to win the daughter back, that she may no longer be defiled, but made pure. And what we're finding is this very special portion of land is all about the Lord Jesus Christ. And I think when Abraham bought that piece of land, he was thinking of Messiah, that this was going to be the portion of land for him, the resurrected ones, the mighty ones of Israel. And Abraham, when he was told in Genesis 12 that this is the land, he bought that piece for Jesus, that the well could be built there, and that the daughters of Abraham may be won by Messiah and not defiled like Jacob's. Abraham was a remarkable brother with a remarkable spirit, with a remarkable mind, with one remarkable faith. Thinking of the son of Abraham right there in Genesis chapter 4, and Jacob knew it as he placed his hand upon the head of Joseph. Keep this inheritance for the greater than Joseph, for the Lord Jesus Christ. They're all signposts, aren't they? The altar, the tree, and now the well. Well, we're going to pick up another conversation and we're going to go now to Genesis chapter 50. Please. Genesis chapter 50. And now it's Joseph's turn. Now he's a dying man, and now he's got something to say about his inheritance. And have a guess what's on the mind of Joseph? Well, if you look at verse 24, he says, I'm going to die, and God will visit you and take you back to Canaan. And in these final moments, there's going to be something that Joseph is going to say. Notice the phrase in verse 24, God will surely visit you. Who said those words? Jacob said those words to Joseph. And where did Jacob get those words from? Jacob got those words from Abraham. It's the charge, brothers and sisters. There's a charge being passed from a family, a commission, a duty, a job that needs to be done. And they're quoting the same phrases, the same words to one another, father to son, grandfather to grandson, throughout those generations. And now it's Joseph's turn, the favored son of Jacob. And he says now, in these final moments, in verse 25, and Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry my bones. He's thinking about his death. And he's not just thinking about his death, he's thinking about his bones. And if you're thinking about your bones, brothers and sisters, you're thinking about, well, a hope for those bones. And if you're thinking about those bones, brothers and sisters, this is going to be a very long wait. Because it's not the body of Joseph he's thinking about, is it? It's not the body of Joseph, it's the bones. And he recognizes he's going to be in the land of Egypt for a very, very long time. And he believes that, when the time comes, there's just going to be the bones left. And the final wish, he says to those people surrounding him, when the moment arrives to go back to the land of Canaan, he marks his duty to those who would listen: don't forget me. And he makes them swear an oath that over the next 100 or so years, if not more, that in time, in the future, someone out of the ether would remember the bones of Joseph. And he makes them swear an oath. Now, Joseph died in Egypt, didn't he? And he died 110 years of age. And, he was in the land of Egypt in his death a very long time. A very long time. And it seems to me that, Joseph spent the majority of his time in Egypt, didn't he? Well over half his life was in Egypt. He had an Egyptian wife. He had an Egyptian job. He had an Egyptian house. He had half Egyptian children. He had an Egyptian estate. It seems to me that everything about Joseph's life was all about Egypt, and yet all he could think about was going back home to Canaan. That old piece of ancient land with nothing but dust and wilderness. Despite the splendor of Egypt, that was the home of Joseph, and in his bitter regret, he never saw that land. He never went back. And the dying plea was to go back to the land of Canaan. And so we're going to pick up our golden thread and we're going to go now to Exodus, because the story continues in Exodus chapter 1. And when we come to Exodus chapter 1, we are introduced to a Pharaoh, aren't we? A new king Pharaoh. And would anyone remember what the phrase is about this new Pharaoh? What does it say about him? He knew not Joseph. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? And the last words of Joseph was, "Don't forget me." And here we have a king, a new Pharaoh, who'd forgotten Joseph. But there was one man growing up in the courts of Egypt. One young man who was pulled from the bulrushes in a tiny little basket, who grew up in those courts and had a deep love for his people. Who do you think inspired Moses? If Pharaoh knew not of Joseph, then Moses did. And it was Moses who took the commission. Because if you look in Exodus chapter 13 now, and verse 19, Moses makes it a national responsibility to do something before they embark on the journey, after they've celebrated Passover. There's all this stuff going on. Imagine all this. Imagine Moses, he's been given the commission to lead Israel. He's been introduced to the name, I will be whom I will be. He's been told to go through the Red Sea. He's seen 10 plagues poured upon the nation of Egypt. He's then been told to put on the blood and the lintels. He's been told all this responsibility, but he remembered one thing. To do what? to take the bones of Joseph. And in verse 19, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn to the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones away hence with you. And the bones were carried, it tells us, in a box. Now, what's fascinating is there was another box carried. Anyone remember what that box was? The ark. Do you know what another word for ark is? It's the word coffin. There were two arks carried in the wilderness. One of a dead man's bones, and one of a box that speaks of eternity. Just out of interest, who carried the coffin of the Ark of the Covenant? It was the family of Kohath. And what tribe was Moses from? In fact, let's ask a better question. What family was Moses from? Well, he was from the family of Kohath. And it was the responsibility of the family of Moses to carry the Ark of the Covenant. What family do you think carried the Ark of Joseph? Who was his firstborn heir? Well, we're told in Genesis 50 it became Ephraim. And who was the head of the family of Ephraim? A man who carried the coffin of Joseph, whose name means Yeshua. Joshua became the head of the family of Joseph, and I believe it was the family of Ephraim who carried a dead man's bones, led by a man whose name means salvation. And what is the Greek form of Joshua? Jesus. And isn't it remarkable, in those two boxes, one man or one ark, the Ark of the Covenant, was led by a man of the law, Moses, and the dead man's bones were carried by the family of the man, Jesus, who was not of the law, but of grace. And I believe those two coffins were an exhortation to that the children in the wilderness for those 40 years. And as they cross over the River Jordan, there they were, the two boxes, one of Joseph and one of the Ark of the Covenant, one representing life, the other represented death, one of the law, one of the grace. He became an exhortation, brothers and sisters, in his death. He inspired a nation for 40 years, and he was just bones in a coffin, carried. Well, we're nearly there. We're nearly there. We've got to get to the end, haven't we? What's this all about? Well, we're going to turn now to Joshua chapter 24. Joshua 24, and now we see Joshua, type of Christ. And now, brothers and sisters, have a guess what? These are Joshua's last words. We've gone through Abraham's words. We've gone from Jacob's last words. We've gone from Joseph's last words. And now it falls upon the charge of Joshua. It's the same charge, passed from generation to generation. And now Joshua gets before the people in his final words in chapter 24, and he embarks on a story of their entire history. He speaks of Abraham coming out of Ur. He goes right through the history about their deliverance from Egypt and the conquests of Joshua, and then he finalizes his statement in verse 25 to 26, where they start to settle in their inheritance. And verse 25, so Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and set a statute and an audience in where? Where is he? Here he is. He's in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in a book of the law of God and took a great stone and set it at where? At the oak of Moreh, where it all began in Genesis chapter 12, where God says to him, stop, this is the land. And we come to the final words of Joshua, and just as Abraham saw it for the first time, the very first piece they saw was Shechem. And there's the oak still standing. And if the oak is still there, what else might be there as a ruin? The altar. Here is Abraham's inheritance, a portion, right there. And look what he does. Well, he gets a stone and he places it next to a tree. And when I give you the symbols of a tree and a stone, what do you think about? Christ. Right there at Shechem, we have the symbols of death and resurrection, that he was placed upon a tree and he was resurrected by the rolling away of a stone. And how fitting that at the place of a tree and at the place of a stone, there's going to be a burial. Who do you think is going to be buried in Joshua chapter 24? The place of the tree, the place of the altar, at the place of Shechem. It's Joseph. The coffin, the burial, in verse 32, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought out of the Egypt, buried they in Shechem in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought. And we said there was an altar, we said there was a tree, but what else was there, do you think? In fact, what else do we know was there? Because it's in the Gospels. There's a well. And we see here that a dead man is buried next to a living spring. What a story of the hope of Israel. Because it's not called Shechem, is it? Jacob called it El Elohe Israel, the strength of the powerful ones of Israel. Joseph's inheritance wasn't just Shechem. His inheritance was a living stream. And who does that point to? Whose inheritance was Joseph? The tree, the stone, the well. His inheritance was Christ. Resurrected in the hope of the Lord Jesus Christ, right there in Joshua chapter 24. And isn't it fascinating when you see verse 32 that the plot was bought for what? Pieces of silver. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? A place of burial, bought for pieces of silver. You know, when we come to Hebrews chapter 11 and we see the titans of faith, and we come to Joseph, out of all of the acts of Joseph, what is he most commended for? In Hebrews chapter 11, you think about it. You think about what Joseph went through, and the placing in the pit, and Potiphar's wife, and being laid there in prison, and then esteemed amongst the second in command. Of all the acts of Joseph, what was he most commended for, do you think? In Hebrews chapter 11. Anyone remember? The bones. And out of all of the acts of faith, why do you think the mentioning of his bones were the most precious in God's eyes? Because that was an act of faith that took him beyond the grave. that took him to the Lord Jesus Christ. Brothers and sisters, my final chapter, and I'm not typically British, because when we say final chapter, we mean there's 5 more to go. No, this is it. This is it. Let me just check. Yes, it is. Acts chapter 7. It is my final chapter, please. Acts 7. Why do you think, brothers and sisters? Well, his faith went beyond the grave. Where do we connect the loop here? Shechem, the land meaning the place of the burden, and Joseph has taken that burden. He's desperate to find his brethren. And in Acts chapter 7, I'd like to, test your brains with this. Because you see in verse 15 to 16, this is the speech of Stephen. So Jacob went down into Egypt and died, he and our fathers, and were carried over into where? Shechem, and laid in a sepulchre that Abraham bought for a sum of money. There's one word I'd like us to just focus on, just one very straightforward word. And it's the word there, fathers. I'm going to ask you a question. Where were the fathers buried? Where was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their respected wives buried? In a cave, in Machpelah, in Hebron. So who are the fathers in Acts chapter 7? Who was buried at Shechem? His 11 brethren. He found them. And he brought them back to the place he lost them right at the beginning. And I don't think, brothers and sisters, it was just Joseph's coffin that was carried in the wilderness. I think there were 12 coffins. One for the 12 brothers of Jacob, carried by each family, and all buried in Joshua chapter 24 at Shechem. For it was the fathers, by the final deed of Joseph, that in his dying wish, it wasn't just his bones, that it was going to be the brethren in which they hated him for. The brethren in which they threw him into a pit. The brethren in which they sold him as a slave. The brethren in which they delivered him in envy. It was those brethren in the mind of Joseph. In his closing remarks, I believe they were all taken to Shechem. In other words, brothers and sisters, when Jacob purchased that land, he purchased a graveyard and gave it to Joseph for an inheritance, so that Joseph could make sure, as the firstborn heir, that all the family of Jacob were there together, home, in the fields, where they herded their sheep. The most inconspicuous place on planet Earth is Shechem. And underneath the earth are 11 of the most, 12 really, of the most wonderful men who ever existed. And as Jesus stood with the woman of Samaria, he said the words, "I am the well of the living waters that gives everlasting life." And he said that on top of a cemetery where 12 of the fathers lay rest. And we've gone full circle, haven't we? Where we began at Shechem and we end with Shechem. Shechem, the burden bearer. And Joseph became the burden bearer and took them home. And the thing is, brothers, this is my final remark, is that they're waiting, aren't they, for another man who was sold for pieces of silver, another man that was sold into slavery, another man that was put into a pit, another man who was the favored son, another man who wore the garment, another man who gave that evil report amongst his brethren, another man who was the son of Jacob, another man who was the greater than Joseph. And the Lord Jesus Christ is going to come to that place, Shechem, and there he will meet 12 brothers. And I dare say that Jacob had the whole thing planned in his head right from the purchase. Because when he named that place Shechem, the mighty ones of Israel, he was calling that place the resurrected ones of Israel. Jacob knew that that place was going to be the place where 12 brothers would be resurrected. And isn't it remarkable that a man called Joseph planned the burial of a group of people who were resurrected? Just out of interest, who planned the burial of Jesus? A man called Joseph. Thank you.